Welcome back. Sometimes you hear the cliche that ancient Egypt was a timeless land where nothing ever changed. And I think the reason for this is that Egyptian art does stay almost exactly the same for thousands of years. But in terms of history, Egypt goes through a number of very different and distinct periods. And in this lecture, I want to first describe the unique geography of Egypt, and then I want to give you a kind of overview of several thousand years of Egyptian history, which will conclude in the second lecture on ancient Egypt. In Egypt, maybe more than in any other civilization that we will look at in this course, it's the geography of the land that plays a huge role in shaping nearly every single aspect of the culture that develops there, including the most fundamental aspects of Egyptian religious beliefs. About 97% of Egypt consists of absolutely bleak, uninhabitable desert. Even among desert regions, the Egyptian desert is a particularly harsh and deadly example. It's a completely dried out, really nightmarish landscape of shifting sands and blistering heat in which it's impossible to survive. To be honest, when I first visited the Egyptian desert, it reminded me of pictures that I had seen of the surface of the moon. Most likely, Egypt would have always just remained an empty wasteland, an area that nobody wanted to go to, either in antiquity or today, except for one factor, and that is the river Nile. The Nile cuts right through the middle of this otherwise completely inhospitable land. The Nile is the longest river in the world, and it flows northwards for thousands of miles from its origins way down in the heart of Africa. And it ends in a broad series of channels which fan out to form a delta that empties into the Mediterranean Sea. As the Nile traverses Egypt, it has a very special and unique quality. Every June, like clockwork, the waters slowly begin to rise. And eventually the river just gently overflows its banks and the waters spread out in a flood over the nearby land. So it's a flood, but it's sort of the opposite of a flash flood. It's gradual. And in the delta regions where the river goes into the Mediterranean, this annual inundation can reach a height of 30 feet above the normal water level. And once those waters have peaked, they stay there for several months. Finally, in October, the waters just as slowly begin to subside and they creep back to their normal levels. And by mid-November, the flood's over for the year. Now, it's because of that event that life was possible in Egypt. And not just possible, but it granted to Egypt what was maybe the richest agricultural land in all the ancient world. And this is because when those floodwaters go back, they leave behind what the ancient Egyptians viewed as a miraculous gift, a layer of newly deposited, rich black soil that's extraordinarily fertile. And because of that long inundation, the soil, as well as all the layers piled up underneath it, is thoroughly saturated with water. So it's perfect farmland. And so central to existence was this kind of rich black earth left by the annual Nile flood that it was actually the inspiration for the name that the ancient Egyptians gave to their entire country. They called it Kemet, literally the black land. And by contrast, the desert they called the red land. The Egyptians had only to just sort of toss seeds into this rich, flood-fertilized soil for crops to just spring forth abundantly. And that narrow strip of land along the Nile is so fertile that ancient Egyptians could grow 2 successive crops in it before the annual flood began once more. It's this little 3% of Egypt that's reached by the floods. And it's really just a long, slender corridor, hundreds of miles long, but never more than a couple miles wide, that is really the inhabitable section of Egypt. And if you look at a satellite photo, even today, of Egypt, or look on Google Maps, you can still see this. You'll see a big gray zone of desert with that narrow green strip running right down the middle. And according to the Greek writer Herodotus, the ancient Egyptians viewed their land as literally the gift of the Nile. And it's a perfect description, because without the Nile River, life in Egypt would be utterly impossible. But the presence of that river with its flood has created a strip of paradise in the middle of a hostile desert. And both in antiquity and today, almost the entire population of Egypt is densely packed into that very narrow stretch of arable land right along the banks of the Nile. So, even though Egypt on a map might be this large country, in reality it just consists of that long ribbon of green surrounded by tannish gray wasteland. And when I was in Egypt, I can remember numerous times where I would be standing on a spot that would be lush green vegetation, and I could literally take one step and I would find myself in an empty landscape of just bleak sand. So the other thing this creates is a land of absolutes, where the boundary between rich farmland and arid desert, and really the boundary between an idyllic life and a truly hideous death, is absolutely sharply defined. When the ancient Egyptians looked at this land, they could not help but be struck by how it was dominated by powerful cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And so central to Egyptian religion was a concept that everything, both human and in nature, went through these sequences of life, death, and rebirth. Now, the most obvious natural cycle was undergone by the Nile itself. Every year before the flood, the river, and really the whole country along with it, would seem to almost dry up and almost die, so that by early summer, the river is just a little trickle of water, the land is all shriveled and brown. But just when it seems like everything is going to perish, here comes the flood. And with that revival of the river, the entire land was reborn and burst into green new life. The predictability of that annual flood also contributed to this idea that that event was part of a great cosmic rhythm. The Egyptians were very well aware of how essential the Nile cycle was to their own existence. And they called the flood the waters of renewal, or the water of life. And without that river and its flood, the Egyptians knew they would die. But because of it, they prospered. We can see this whole attitude very nicely expressed in certain ancient Egyptian documents. For example, they had prayers to the river Nile. One of these prayers reads, "Hail to you, O Nile, who rises onto the earth and comes to give life to Egypt. If the prayers of humans are granted and he rises, then the earth shouts for joy. Every belly is happy, every back shakes with laughter, and every tooth munches." The second great natural force that dominates the Egyptians' lives is the sun. And the sun, on the one hand, could parch the land. It could dry things out. It could kill you. And it made the desert that dangerous, inhospitable place it was. But the Egyptians also knew that the sun was vital to the growth of crops, and they loved its warmth, and they enjoyed basking in it. Now, obviously, one of the most striking aspects of the sun is its daily rotation of being born in the east, passing across the sky, and then apparently it dies and is extinguished in the west. And it's for this reason, by the way, that almost all Egyptian cemeteries and tombs are placed to the west. The west was literally the land of the dead. And in Egyptian, when people died, they called them Westerners. Conversely, the east, the direction from which the sun was reborn, was regarded as the gods' land. For the Egyptians, then, all these powerful natural forces that control their lives, the sun, the river, adhere to a simple but very obvious cyclical pattern. And they observed this, and this imbued them with a sense that the world was a place of order and stability, that it followed a regular routine, and that life would ultimately triumph over death. Furthermore, they viewed themselves as a people who were blessed by the gods, for the gods had granted to them, in the midst of the barren desert, this rich, fertile land. Well, finally, there was a third powerful force that shaped the lives of the ancient Egyptians, and that was their king. Just like the river and just like the sun, he could bring abundance or death and destruction. And just like the river and just like the sun, the king seemingly went through a cycle of life and death. And so they reasoned, if the sun was reborn after its death every day, and if the river was reborn after its apparent death every year, then it only seemed logical that the pharaoh should also be reborn. And so from this simple extrapolation based on those natural rhythms of Egyptian geography, all of Egyptian religion evolved. This is why the Egyptians devised the elaborate and famous processes of mummification, because they thought the king would need the use of his body in the next life. This is also why they buried the king with all the furnishings and treasures and goods that he had enjoyed in this life, because obviously he would want those same things again in the next one. A final important feature of the geography of Egypt is that the country is isolated and protected from other lands by strong natural barriers. To the west is that terrible desert, the Libyan desert. To the east is the nearly as awful Arabian desert. To the north is the Mediterranean Sea. And to the south, there are a series of 6 cataracts between Aswan and Khartoum that make it hard for anyone to come up the Nile from Central Africa. So, the inhabitable part of Egypt forms a natural unit which is separated and really protected from other areas. And this is in contrast to Mesopotamia, where the openness of its borders encouraged constant warfare and political instability. And we saw a succession of different civilizations rising and falling there. But the physical isolation of Egypt enables the Egyptians to dwell for a long time unbothered by other people. Those natural barriers which surround the land allow a single continuous culture to thrive for thousands of years, rather than having a whole bunch of different civilizations supplanting one another like in Mesopotamia. All right, so Egypt's geography influences its most fundamental ideas about religion, and it obviously influences its politics. Now let's begin our survey of Egyptian history. The isolation of Egypt, it's not affected by other cultures. And so Egypt develops a strong sense of communal, mutual identity. And this will always make the Egyptians have a feeling of us and them, that they're one group and outsiders are a different group. And over the course of the rest of this lecture, we'll look at Egyptian history from its very beginnings up until the point when its isolation that's protected it is permanently shattered by invaders who come from the outside. So, from really before history existed, before recorded history, Egypt had always been divided up into these separate little districts which were called nomes. Nomes are the building blocks that Egypt is made up of. And even when Egypt is a unified country, everybody still remembers what nome they originally came from. And when the centralized Egyptian government falls apart, Egypt tends to split back up into its little constituent nomes. Think of a nome as being equivalent almost to a county. So it's bigger than a city, kind of smaller than a state. In the earliest phase of Egyptian history, certain alliances had gradually built up until there were really two main factions in Egypt. First of all, there was an area called Upper Egypt. And Upper Egypt is the riverlands that are to the south. And then there's Lower Egypt, which is the Nile Delta, the marshy lands to the north. Upper and Lower Egypt will always be the two distinct parts of the country. And all of this takes place during an era of Egyptian history that we call the pre-dynastic phase. And quite honestly, we have very little reliable documentation for that period. Then along comes the man who really starts Egyptian history. His name is Narmer. He may also be the same as a sort of semi-mythical figure named Menes. Around 3100 BC, Narmer gains control of Upper Egypt, and he unites together all its nomes. Then he does something truly remarkable. In a great battle, he defeats the coalition of Lower Egypt, and for the very first time, he unites the two regions together. And this is a profoundly important moment, because by doing this, he creates Egypt as a unified country which fills its natural geographic borders. And in doing so, he becomes the first Egyptian pharaoh. Now, Narmer and all the pharaohs that will follow him always still call themselves the kings of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is signified by the fact that the pharaohs actually wore two crowns, one placed on top of the other. One was the white cobra crown of Upper Egypt, and the other was the red vulture crown of Lower Egypt. So next time you see a movie on ancient Egypt, look to see that the pharaoh is actually wearing those two crowns. One of the very earliest archaeological relics that we have from Egypt is a stone carving called the Narmer palette. And on one side, it shows Narmer with the white crown smiting an enemy, and on the back side, it shows him wearing the red crown in a procession. And this is not only a very famous and wonderful piece of Egyptian art, but it has enormous historical significance because it actually provides evidence for the real historical existence of Narmer himself. As a capital of the new united Egypt, he chose a place called Memphis, which, logically enough, was located right at the point where the two lands met. Across the river from Memphis, on the western bank, the land of the dead, was the cemetery, and that was a place called Saqqara. And Saqqara would be the site of one of the great architectural revolutions in all of human history. Egypt now enters what is its first really reliably attested historical period, a period that we have records from. And we call this era the Old Kingdom. One of the early pharaohs of the Old Kingdom was named Zoser. But don't worry about him so much. I'm more interested in his vizier. His vizier is his master of affairs, his right-hand man. And that was a guy named Imhotep. Imhotep is a very interesting person. He's a legendary figure. It's hard to know, did he really exist or has his reputation been inflated? But he's credited with being a kind of a man of many talents. He was a genius in all sorts of things. He was an architect. He was a doctor. He wrote poetry. He does seem probably to have really existed, or at least to have been based on some actual person. And it's this Imhotep who is charged with building the tomb that would hold the body of King Zoser. And Imhotep was determined to give Zoser a tomb that was better than any that had ever come before. Now, the standard way in which kings had been buried thus far in Egypt was that they were entombed inside a long, flat-topped platform. This was called a mastaba. Can you guess what a mastaba was made out of? Yeah, as with almost every other building in the early civilizations, they had always been made out of mud bricks. But at Saqqara, Imhotep began an architectural revolution because he decided to build a giant mastaba not out of mud, but of stone. The The world had never before seen a monumental stone building. And you can imagine how impressive this would have been to the Egyptians to see the first great stone building when you'd never seen one before. But Imhotep didn't stop there. He then created a structure that was like several mastabas piled one on top of the other, forming a sort of colossal stairway to heaven for the soul of his king. And this structure, devised by Imhotep, became known as a step pyramid. And it was the very first pyramid, and it was the first monumental stone building in all the world. This innovation of Imhotep laid the foundation for all the pyramids of Egypt that would come. And pretty soon, somebody got the idea, why don't we just smooth out those sides, and so it's not stepped anymore, and now we have true Egyptian pyramids. And so the Old Kingdom is the golden age of pyramid building. Almost all the pyramids that you've seen photos of, including the famous pyramids of Giza, were built during the Old Kingdom. And these were amazing achievements. The pyramids, some of them are made up of millions of tons of huge stone blocks. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, the most famous pyramid, for example, is nearly 500 feet tall. And it's made up of 2 million big stone blocks, each one of which averages about 2 tons in weight. And that pyramid, by the way, probably remained the highest structure in the world for about 4,500 years until the Eiffel Tower was built. Sometimes you'll hear people say that the pyramids were built using slave labor. And this is not actually true. It is true that later in Egyptian history, slaves were used to build temples and other types of structures, palaces. But in the Old Kingdom, in this golden age of pyramids, these buildings were the efforts of the Egyptians themselves. And how it worked is during the flood months, people could not work on their farms. They were underwater. So they would use this idle time to work on the pharaoh's pyramid. And because of the godlike status of the pharaoh, they regarded this as holy work. It was something that there was an honor to participate in. And we know how the workers felt because they would carve inscriptions on the stones that they hauled. And each work gang would choose a name for themselves. And some of the names that are attested are things like the king's favorites or the hard-working gang. Over time, there's a kind of trickle-down effect, so that this idea of gaining a life after death spreads to others besides just the pharaoh and his family. And so other people become interested in having their bodies preserved after death as well. Chief officials, administrators, generals, aristocrats, all of them want to be buried near the pharaoh so that maybe some of his immortality rubs off on them. And so pyramids become surrounded by cities of the dead and by little miniature pyramids and other tombs. And all these people hope to share somewhat in the renewal after death for which the king was being prepared. And these aristocrats start to build bigger and bigger and more elaborate tombs for themselves. Meanwhile, however, something interesting is happening. The pyramids of the kings start to get smaller and smaller. So over time, these noblemen are gaining more power, they're controlling more of the kingdom and more of its wealth. And eventually, they even begin to contest with the pharaohs for dominance. Also, the economy becomes strained by this competition as well as other factors. And some people also found evidence that there was a severe drought that struck the Old Kingdom. And under all these pressures, the country fragments. It goes back to nomes, and the Old Kingdom comes to an end. Now, for later Egyptians, the Old Kingdom would become an idealized time. They would remember it as a happy, peaceful, prosperous era when the country was blessed by the gods and everything was sort of perfect. Egypt falls back into its constituent nomes, and for a while there's just chaos. And this period is called the First Intermediate Period. Conventional dates are from about 2181 to 2041 BC. And the kind of uncertainty of this time, when no one's quite sure who's in charge, is nicely captured in a surviving document that we have that describes the atmosphere of the First Intermediate Period. This document reads, "The archer sits prepared. Criminals are everywhere. A man must go out to plow with his shield. Brother fights against brother. Robbers lurk under bushes, just waiting for unfortunate travelers in order to steal their goods. The thief is the rich man." Eventually, another strong leader from Upper Egypt named Montuhotep will compel the rest of the lords of Egypt to accept his rule. And in doing so, he founds what ancient historians have not very creatively labeled the Middle Kingdom. It lasts from about 2040 to 1782 BC. The Middle Kingdom was a very, very different sort of time from the Old Kingdom. In the Old Kingdom, everyone had been confident, there had been sort of infinite faith. But in the Middle Kingdom, people had seen it all fall apart. The world could never again be as perfect as they once thought it had been. And the kings of the Middle Kingdom had a much more openly antagonistic relationship with their noblemen and with the strong families scattered throughout Egypt. And they were always testing their power and testing to see if they could take the king's place. From this period, we have some letters which were actually written by one pharaoh to his son. And in them, he warns his son not to trust anybody, because a king can find enemies anywhere, even in his own palace. He says, this is addressed to his son, "Listen to what I tell you, that you may be king of earth, and that you may rule the riverbanks. Guard yourself against your subordinates. Trust no one as a brother. Make no friends. Have no close companions. They cannot be counted upon. There is no good outcome for he who is not always on his guard." From documents such as this one, we get a real sense of a kind of jaded, brooding, suspicious time, which now has to deal with all the realities of human greed and jealousy. So it's a very different tone from the Old Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, there was not as much labor available to build giant state projects like pyramids. Too much energy is being spent just keeping the peace. There's an increased police force as well. So when it comes to building pyramids in this time, they have to cut corners. And they do this by making most of the pyramids of the Middle Kingdom out of mud brick. Now, they still covered those with an outer layer of smooth limestone. So on the outside, it looks just like the old pyramids. But if you think about it, these Middle Kingdom pyramids are a perfect metaphor for the era. On the surface, everything looks just as good. But if you scratch away that surface, underneath, the core is weaker. It's just mud. Well, predictably, Egypt once more falls apart into its component nomes. First, it splits into the two lands, and then back into individual nomes, and the Middle Kingdom collapses. This begins another period of disunity and confusion, which is called the Second Intermediate Period, from about 1782 to 1570 BC. And it's during this Second Intermediate Period that a completely new element enters Egyptian history. And this is one that will have long-lasting effects. The desert and the water borders of Egypt had helped to protect the land from invaders. But all of this changes when a rather mysterious group known as the Hyksos invades and conquers Lower Egypt. In the next lecture on Egypt, we'll pick up the story at this point, and we'll see what happens with the Hyksos, as well as looking at the next phase of Egyptian history, which is called the New Kingdom. And that's an era that contains many of the most famous names of Egyptian history, including Ramses the Great and King Tutankhamun. We'll also look at some of the key myths in Egyptian religion and at their concept of what happens to the soul after death. And we'll see how those ideas also were shaped and formed by Egypt's unique environment. Thank you.